Hello and welcome to another episode of the Of Interest podcast. My name is Dan Brunskill. Today we're talking about the year of elections with Stephen Jacobi. Stephen is the Executive Director of New Zealand International Business Forum and a former diplomat and trade policy advisor. As a diplomat, Stephen has done stints in Canada and in France, making him very well positioned to comment on the recent European elections, but he was also the Executive Director of the New Zealand-US Council for almost a decade, meaning he's also the perfect person to ask about the upcoming US presidential elections, which could have very significant impacts for New Zealand, depending on who wins. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, kia ora, Dan. It's great to be with you and looking forward to this discussion.
Could you, just for the sake of the listeners, run us through a sort of highlights reel of your career?
Well, at the risk of really boring your listeners, I was a civil servant in the Department of Trade and Industry and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, had a few postings overseas, one in Paris, one in Canada, got out while the going was good, and then went into business, ran an industry organisation, then moved into consulting. And in that role, I've had a number of organisations I've worked with, particularly, as you mentioned, the NZ-US Council for a number of years, and later the New Zealand-China Council, and also the New Zealand International Business Forum, which is the major exporters coming together to think about trade and trade policy. And that's what I'm continuing to do.
Is life as a diplomat as romantic as it seems in the movies?
Well, it was a great career, and I very much liked it. It had its ups and downs. We had great postings. It's actually hard work overseas. I know no one will believe this, but it actually is. And particularly, I think for diplomats these days, the world has become a lot harder to make progress on. But, you know, things happen. And when I was in Paris, it was the middle of Rainbow Warrior. So a pretty unique sort of time, really. And every posting has its own challenges.
We should do an entire episode about that. But let's stay on topic for now. You had a posting to Paris. We've just had a big election in France where people expected the sort of rising right, which is a very popular narrative, to take over, but they didn't succeed in doing so. What do you make of that? Election has also been more success with the right-wing politicians in the EU Parliament. These more extreme, both on left and on the right, I suppose, elections in Europe, what sort of implications do they have for New Zealand from a trade perspective? Is there any outcome, or do we sort of have a free trade deal already?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, and you mentioned it in your introduction, that we are living in a very uncertain and anxious world. And in the sort of world we're living in today, it is very easy for unscrupulous politicians to appeal to voters and to give them an impression that those extreme policies, whether on the left or the right for that matter, can provide the answer. People are looking for, solutions. They want things that work. They're tired of things that don't work. And that's the context, I think, for what we're seeing, particularly in Europe and in the United States, but in different ways around the world. I mean, no sets of elections are quite simple, the same, because they're all on different cycles, electoral cycles, and reflecting different views. But the one in France is interesting because, of course, we saw quite clearly an extreme right-wing party. I mean, it's hard for us in New Zealand, I think, to realise just how extreme the Rassemblement National is. But the French newspaper Libération just did a survey of 43 of its, sorry, I just can't recall the number, 160 or something MPs. 43 of them have been found to hold racist, violent, or completely mad views. They use a wonderful French word called délirant, delirious views. I mean, mostly around, conspiracy theories.
Right.
I mean, these people are right out on the edge. And President Macron called their bluff, and there's a lot of discussion about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it certainly showed that the support they got in the European election was not the one that the French public was going to give them. However, they are there in Parliament in a large number and are going to be a force going forward. When it comes to our relations with France and indeed with Europe, and particularly in the trade sphere, well, we have a free trade agreement with Europe that was signed last year, and it is in place and now being implemented. I think that protects us from a lot of backsliding from whatever national governments do in Europe. Remember, trade policy is a European
Hmm.
competence. Of course, you can never rule out that something might happen. But that FTA didn't do everything that New Zealand wanted. In fact, in agriculture, didn't do very much of what we wanted. But in some other areas, it has got a lot of very good things in it, and there's a very good basis to continue to build that relationship. But we need stable economies, stable politics, and we need countries and economic blocs that abide by the rules of international trade and the international trading system. And any of these movements that go in another direction can damage us.
I know these lots of these more sort of right-leaning parties are propelled by sort of anti-immigration and anti-globalist sentiment. Does that extend to trade as well? Are they also sort of trade skeptic, like we might see in the US?
Oh yes, yes, they are indeed, and certainly the Rassemblement National is, and it has talked all sorts of things about blocking this and that, and they are economic nationalists. Of course, it's all going to be self-defeating for them, and in particular in a country like France, which is a very strong exporter around the world. No one ever seems to realize this, that it can hurt you. The more you want to try to protect your own industries at home can hurt those industries internationally. France is a huge exporter of agriculture products, of luxury goods, of high-tech products. It simply would not make sense. But these parties are propelled by a different sort of rationale. There's a wonderful quote by the French writer Albert Camus, who said something like, "When democracy is sick, fascism comes to its bed, but it's not there to ask how the patient is doing."
You might be the first person to quote Camus on our podcast, Stephen. It's very good.
Well, there you go. Albert Camus, great guy.
So you mentioned that we have a free trade agreement earlier with the European Union. How durable is a free trade agreement? If a right wing, or an anti-trade bloc did manage to get a majority in the EU Parliament, is that something they can just rip up, or are they more durable than that?
Well, in theory, trade agreements, are solemn sovereign undertakings by the countries and economic entities that sign them, but they are possible to get out of. It's not easy because you'd have to. There are processes to go by. You're going to face damages in terms of the access that your exporters are going to have to those other markets. It's this point I was just making. It's not a simple thing to do, but it can be done. In the case of Europe, of course, it's not the Parliament. It is, in fact, the Commission that would need to make that sort of decision. And that's a decision that's going to have to reflect the views of the member states. But it would be huge in its implications. So I would say that the FTA is fairly durable. And I feel that I think the problem would be more that it wouldn't be able to be extended, expanded, or even opened up further, which we would like to see in New Zealand. I mean, we want to see if we can actually continue to open the European market. That could become a lot harder.
Yeah. Okay. The other election in Europe that has just happened is the UK election. End of Tory power, Labour coming in. It seems like there's quite a lot of continuity there on their trade and foreign policy. Do you see any implications for, the global trading environment or New Zealand with a change of government in the UK?
Well, I don't see negative implications. Let's put it that way. Again, our FTA with the UK is signed and in the process of being implemented, signed, sealed, and being delivered. And the Labour Party, by and large, supported it when it went through the House of Commons. I don't think there's any danger to that. And in particular, I don't see that because the Labour Party has one big overriding challenge, and that is to redress and to improve the UK economy, which is in quite a parlous state. So I think for them, to go backwards on a trade agreement would actually run counter to the things they're wanting to achieve. They've already said in their election manifesto they actually want to do more FTAs. Bear in mind that FTA was negotiated by the Labour government here in New Zealand, and it contains quite a lot of progressive elements. And it's probably likely to appeal to the UK Labour Party. I hope it still appeals to our government. And to the extent that our government wants to cooperate with the UK, then I think it gives a very good platform for doing so. But there's another area I think that's quite interesting, and that is with the arrival of the UK Labour Party in power in Britain, is that it heralds a rather more pragmatic outlook on China. The Conservative Party had got themselves into real difficulty with the relationship with China due to their own views about the nature of Chinese government and the sort of pressure that was able to be brought to bear by their best friend ever in the United States. That was going to be a problem for them going forward for their economic ambitions, because clearly China holds a lot of the opportunity for a Britain that's in charge of its own post-Brexit trade policy. And in one area, and this will impact in New Zealand, because China is wanting to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the UK has just joined the CPTPP. So I think a more pragmatic outlook on China on the part of the Labour government in the UK could actually help that process of Chinese accession. This is not to say that that's an easy process. We can talk more about that because it certainly isn't. But it potentially removes or at least ameliorates one problem and gives us an opportunity to share with the UK some of our experience with China, which I think they will find useful.
So when you say a more pragmatic approach to China, because pragmatic's quite subjective, you mean a sort of openness to trade, accepting the differences,
Yeah.
perhaps more like New Zealand's policy?
Yeah, I mean, cooperating where it makes sense to do so, taking issue with China where their values require them to do so, more a New Zealand viewpoint, a disposition to want to engage, I suppose, rather than a disposition to want to withdraw and put up barriers and all that sort of stuff.
What is the New Zealand deal with having China's accession to the trade agreement? Because if I remember correctly, we supported the UK's accession, but now if you ask a politician about it, they say, oh, we don't sort of support or don't support any specific country. The New Zealand government seems a little bit more cautious when it comes to China joining in. What's going on there?
Well, I think our government's trying to have a bob each way, really, in the sense that it's saying that membership of CPTPP needs to be determined by the membership of the agreement as a whole. And last year, New Zealand chaired a meeting in Auckland of CPTPP ministers that set out a process and some principles for guidelines around future members. And I guess our government is following that, to the letter. So what the Chinese have to do is they have to prove they can meet the high standards of the agreement. They've got to prove that they are responsible members of the global trading system, and they've got to get consensus from everybody. Now, I think probably New Zealand, there are differing views, and of course within government, I suspect, if the economic rationalists had their druthers, it would be that we would support Chinese membership because it's another big country joining our favourite trade agreement, which will encourage others to join. It's about getting China to follow the rules of the game. That's what we want. So by making it harder to follow the rules of the game, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. By the way, it won't make a lot of difference to our trade with China because we already have a fantastic trade agreement and CPTPP can't give us much more than that. But on the bigger picture, it is quite important.
The prize might be that if China is in the agreement, it will attract other countries to join that we currently don't have trade arrangements with.
Correct.
Okay, well, Stephen, you've been very reassuring in terms of Europe, but I think the big question on trade is the US election, where, I don't know, a few weeks ago you might have said it's a toss-up, you might have said Biden was on track to win. Sitting here in New Zealand, it doesn't feel today like Biden is on track to win, and it suddenly feels like everything Trump has been saying has become more important. Talk to me about a Trump presidency, if that were to happen. What does that mean for New Zealand?
Yes, well, this is the big one, isn't it? This is the kind of the sword of Damocles hanging over the global economy. Just when you thought things couldn't get much worse, well, they may well do. Just a point about, I don't know who's going to win the election, obviously, and it probably, by the time we've had this conversation, it will have changed again. But I would have to say that most US business people I talk to are pretty worried that, well, some are worried, some are less worried, but are of the view that Trump will, in fact, come through, and that gives rise to a need to, I suppose, think about that potential outcome. I mean, Trump's trade policy is an absolute disaster. Um, it was when he was the president. He put enormous pressure on the World Trade Organization. He imposed enormous tariffs on China and on others, including New Zealand. We can talk about that. Um, it's all bad. I must say, the Biden presidency hasn't been brilliant for some of those things either, because he hasn't done a lot for the WTO. He's been subsidizing and protecting the US industry. That's not been very good either. But the big thing with President Trump this time, or future President Trump, I should say, is the 10% tariff that he keeps talking about. The 10% tariff, if it could be done, not immediately clear that it could be. Bear in mind, Congress has a role in the imposition of tariffs. It's Congress that actually imposes tariffs, not the president, at least in a durable way. If a 10% tariff was imposed on New Zealand exports to the United States across the board, a lot of trade would be killed off. Mm. That would be very negative for our interests. Of course, it would apply to everybody, one assumes, but of course, it would make US production more competitive, and that's where we would potentially lose.
Okay, so we do not have a free trade agreement with the US, but our exports have been rising there. There's sort of an unofficial policy that perhaps New Zealand exporters might like to shift away from China a little bit, and the US is the only other market sort of a comparable size, at least in dollar terms. 10% tariff, is that going to stunt that growth in exports? You said we're competing equally with other exporters, I suppose, so it would just be where we're competing with domestic US producers.
Yeah, well, in the things that we would be exporting in volume, I think it would have quite an impact. That is in things like beef, dairy products, horticultural products, all those sorts of things. Some other things that won't affect at all. And I'm sure the United States would still continue to be an important market for us, but a lot of trade would get affected. And we don't have an FTA with the United States. That means that we cannot be exempted so easily from those sorts of things. When it came to the tariffs that the Trump administration put on our aluminium and steel as a result of some bogus security claim, I mean, the idea was that exports of steel and aluminium to the United States were, a security risk to the United States. So we got caught up in that, and we've had tariffs applied on both of those. We were unable to be exempted because we weren't an FTA partner, but others, like Australia, were exempted. So that puts us in a rather unfortunate position.
There's a risk of that happening again.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a potential that some of our competitors might get exempted. I mean, who knows how this is going to work, even if it's possible, but it would not be a very good thing. It would also give rise to a huge number of trade disputes, including from New Zealand, I would imagine. So, I don't know. It's not looking good.
Might be good for the exports of trade law services.
It'll be marvelous for that if we could ever get through the quagmire of the WTO, because the United States, of course, has rendered unworkable that dispute settlement system. So I'm not sure it would provide a lot of protection for us.
One thing I find difficult about following US elections is it feels quite different to elections here in the UK, where quite specific policy positions are set out ahead of the election, and they say, if we're elected, we will do these things that are in our manifesto. It feels like that doesn't happen so much in the US election. These politicians are just out giving speeches, and then when they get in office, they sort of do something that gestures in that direction. How this sort of idea of this 10% tariff, how firm of an idea is that? What do you think the chances of it actually being implemented is? You said there's some complications there in terms of who actually is responsible. How do you assess, a politician says something at a speech, how do you assess if it's actually going to happen or not?
Well, it's very easy to assume that it's too difficult and wouldn't happen. And I think we probably thought that the last time Trump was in power. It wouldn't happen that they would leave TPP, but they left on the first day. It wouldn't happen that he would put huge tariffs on China, but he did it. So I think this time we have to be a little more, uh, you know, we need to suspend our judgment a wee bit about whether things will or won't. I mean, all you can do is look at what is being talked about. And the thing in the United States, of course, is that all elections are local. So the local issues in this election are going to determine a lot of different things, not to mention the big culture questions on abortion and states' rights and all those sorts of things that complicate the picture enormously for everybody. But this election looks like it's going to be won by a small group of undecided voters in a small number of swing states. And they will be making decisions, I think, based a lot on personalities and local questions, making the whole picture very difficult to see.
You are no longer a diplomat, but you're quite familiar with our foreign service. What sort of how will they be looking at the election, and how will they be assessing the risks, and what preparations would they be making ahead of time? Is that something you react to when it happens, or do you sort of think about it in advance? Well, how do you even go about that?
Yes, I remember when I went on a posting to Canada. It was at the time of the referendum about Quebec separation from the rest of Canada, and I met with a senior person in foreign affairs who said to me, "Oh, by the way, tell us when it happens, won't you?" And then he said, "Oh, actually, no, tell us just before it happens." So I suppose that's sort of the advice that a lot of foreign affairs officers are getting even today. No, there'll be a lot of effort being put into understanding, engaging, making sure our analysis is the best it can be. I mean, this is actually quite a problem now for diplomacy. Of course, when I was a diplomat back in the 18th century, you didn't have to worry about social media and the vast amount of information that was coming out. There is a lot of that. But what our diplomats are doing, is they are looking at it from a New Zealand perspective, and only they can really make that analysis, that call, and that judgment based on not just the things they're reading, but the people they're meeting. So our people will be out meeting all sorts of people. And, we've just got a new ambassador in Washington, D.C., Rosemary Banks, and she has been obviously a very highly qualified and capable ambassador indeed. She's gone back to Washington because she was there the last time when Trump was in power. I'm not saying that's a punt on the part of the New Zealand government about who's going to win, far from it, because she's also, able to work on both sides of the aisle, I'm sure. But I think it just shows you that, we need to have the best people and the best that we have to be able to read those signs. And of course, we have the Prime Minister there this week meeting people on both sides of the aisle, and it's right that he should do so. And we have to do business with the United States, whoever they elect. And that's the fundamental role of a diplomat, to be able to continue to do that, even when the wrong results may be delivered.
Do you think there's anything Luxon could be doing in the US right now? And obviously these meetings are behind closed doors and we don't know exactly what is said, but do you think that he could be sending any messages up in that direction? What could he actually be? I guess what I'm asking. Sorry, asking that question very poorly. I guess with Luxon in the US, what work could he be doing behind the scenes to maybe prepare for these sort of tariffs or outcomes?
Well, I think the critical thing that the Prime Minister needs to be doing, and I'm sure is doing in Washington, is saying that New Zealand is an engaged and knowledgeable and active partner for the United States and for other countries who want to see a world in which international rules and the rule of law, particularly in trade, and the international system is upheld. And he'll be talking up our credentials in those areas. We share a lot of views with the United States, but we have different views on some things, not the least of which on China. I hope he can bring this will be very difficult and rather delicate, a kind of a different viewpoint or a nuanced viewpoint about some of those things. The reality is United States assumption of this competitive stance vis-a-vis China it is potentially very damaging to the rest of the world and to countries like New Zealand and our friends in the Asia Pacific region. But we want to be able to share those views with the United States while saying we are still interested in cooperation and the range of endeavours in which we are partners. I do think he needs to make a very strong point around trade agreements, trade rules, TPP, all those things that we still think are extremely valuable as a small economy. But he wants to press the flesh and smile and just get across the idea that we're great people down here. And I guess when he's talking to business, and he said this, he needs to be making the case for US investment in New Zealand. We have a massive task of economic development here. And we can't have the sort of economy that we want to have unless we increase foreign investment. We don't have the best reputation around the world as a country to invest in because we have governments that come and go and they change the rules and they do them quickly and they don't consult. And some of our processes are very arcane. So we want to reassure, it's his line, we're open for business. Actually, I'm not really sure we were closed for business. Okay, maybe we were during the pandemic, but actually we still did business during then. But that we are wanting to encourage people to come here and make the most of what we've got, our world-class agriculture, our great renewable energy, our great digital companies. We need their help.
Does it strike you ironic at all, Stephen, that we have we're constantly worrying about trade penalties from China and talking about how we need to diversify away in case there's conflict in the future, and the partner we're diversifying towards is looking at imposing a 10% tariff on us. Does that seem ironic to you?
Let's go figure. This is the country that won't give us a trade agreement. I spent 10 years of my life trying to argue for an FTA with the United States and thought we'd had it in TPP, only to see them leave when President Trump got elected. China, on the other hand, has opened its market to us since 2008, has done everything we wanted them to do. Look, it's not always easy doing business with China, let's face it. And there are ups and downs and problems, and we've still got them. But by and large, they have opened their market to us, and it has transformed our economy. I'm not a fan of the diversification idea away from China. In my view, the only alternative to China is China. We cannot sell elsewhere the things we sell in volume to China. Of course, we want to have a range of markets to export into. Of course, our exporters need options. But let's be realistic. The Chinese consumers want to buy what we have to sell. And we need to make the most of that for as long as we can. And we need to manage the relationship consistent with our values, but in a way that preserves our ability to do business. And I think successive New Zealand governments have been doing that. I hope we don't get too carried away with AUKUS. I think that's not a good idea. Here I'm putting my cards on the table. Military cooperation, fine. Interoperability with the United States and with Australia, fine. Technology purchases, fine. But entering an arrangement that is somehow connected with a partnership that's directed at our major trading partner, I just don't see the basis for it. So it's a tricky road, I think, that we have to walk. But as I say, we've got a need for economic development. That means we need trade, we need investment, we need partnerships, we need friends.
And it seems like the risk, the trade risk in the US also exists. It's not only in China where there is a risk that our trade will be disrupted. That is a risk in the US as well. Forget about the.
Well, the risk is greater. The risk is greater from the United States potentially with a change of government. I guess the thing is there's always this sort of thought that if we were to become too critical of the Chinese government in some area, they may try to take action against us, as they have done with other partners. We have not seen anything of that. It's not as if New Zealand hasn't criticised China. Give me a break. It seems to me we criticise them every 5 minutes. But perhaps that's who we are. But the Chinese know who we are. They know we're a Western allied country. They know where we've come from. They know we're a democracy. They know we care about human rights. And I feel we can manage that in a way that enables us to express those values which is important, but also maintain the ability to do business.
Stephen, you work a lot with businesses in New Zealand, exporters. How do you see them thinking, particularly about the US, but the trade outlook generally? And are you seeing them make any changes, investment decisions, as they look out to the US election and sort of see the risks? What are you hearing? What are people thinking about? What are people thinking about doing?
Well, I would say here that for the first time in my far too long career is that companies are thinking more about geopolitical issues than they ever have done. They're thinking about them, but by and large, there's not a lot that companies can do. They can't stop Putin invading Ukraine. They can't stop the United States and China taking pot shots at each other. They can't influence the outcome of the election in the United States. So I feel that companies are making sure they're abreast of the situation. They're certainly discussing it. It's on the top of the conversation all over the place. It's great for people like me who really get off talking about these sorts of things. But they are doing what is, when it comes to doing, they are doing what is within their purview, which is, as they should be doing, shoring up their businesses, making sure they've got the right partners, contacts, and customers, diversifying their product range where they can in sensitive markets, maybe diversifying their partners if they're able to do it. I think that's harder to do than to say. I think those that are looking at that are thinking about, well, what if something happens here or there? So they are operating in the things that they can control. And as I often say, I think they do need to keep in touch with the government, our Foreign Affairs Ministry, our ministers, to make sure that they are aware of what's at stake with some of these things. What worries me sometimes is that we don't quite compute fully the consequences of our action. I've heard, several politicians talk about AUKUS, for example, but no one really has talked about this in its entirety. They talk either about the security side or they're either talk about the trade side, but we've obviously got to keep the whole thing in balance. So it's important that business people are having those conversations where it counts.
Great. Hey, we're about to run out of time, but to wrap up, why don't you take us back to your philosophical views, bring us back to Camus. It feels like the era of globalization is really winding back. What do you think is driving that? And is there anything we as a nation that loves global trade can do anything about it? Why is this trend reversing? Can anything be done?
Is globalization reversing or not? That is a huge question. I think trade liberalization is certainly reversing, but globalization as a concept is much bigger. It's about the disappearing border. It's about trade, and it's about technology and about tourism and transport. I don't think that's over. We are on the verge now of another huge revolution in technology. When I talked about anxiety earlier as a result of all the things that are happening in the world, we maybe ain't seen nothing yet. We are looking at the AI revolution, which is only starting to transform economies and people's lives. But it's coming. And that is going to take us again, I think, into a world that is much more deeply interconnected and integrated. And it's not about being a neoliberal or about being a communist. It's about reacting to the world as it is before us. If I have one I'm a little more optimistic about AI. It's that we're talking about it so much, as opposed to the last big leap, which was, internet age, where it kind of took us all by surprise. Who's going to be surprised about AI? But how it is going to impact is going to have all sorts of impacts. So here we are. I don't think globalization is dead.
Okay, that's very encouraging. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. It's great to have you on, and we might have to have you back if the election does go Trump's way in November.
Anytime. Thanks very much, Dan. It's been a great conversation.